Victorian Britain, 1887, the empire stood at its height, yet beneath the soot-stained confidence of London's streets, uncertainty gnawed at the age. Factories roared, cities swelled, science raced ahead of morality, and crime slipped easily through the cracks of a rapidly modernizing society. It was into this restless world that a quiet literary experiment appeared in a Christmas edition of Beaton's Christmas Annual. Few noticed it at first. Fewer still could have imagined that this unassuming publication contained the birth of a figure who would outlive empires, outlast his creator, and reshape how humanity understood intelligence itself. And yet, something in those opening pages hinted that the world was about to change in ways no one could yet explain. The author was a young Scottish physician named Arthur Conan Doyle, trained in medicine, steeped in science, and fascinated by the limits of human perception. Doyle was not trying to invent a hero, he was testing an idea. What if reason itself could be dramatized? What if deduction, the cold, disciplined application of logic, could become not just a method, but a form of narrative suspense? From that question emerged Sherlock Holmes, a man introduced without ceremony, living in rented rooms at 221B Baker Street, defined not by his background or emotions, but by his mind. Holmes did not chase criminals through dark alleys or overpower them with fists. He dismantled them calmly, methodically, as if the truth had already surrendered and merely needed to be uncovered. Readers encountered Holmes through the eyes of Dr. John Watson, a wounded army doctor recently returned from Afghanistan. In their very first meeting, Holmes glanced at Watson and announced his entire recent history: military service, injury, and all without having been told a single word. The moment was electrifying, not because it was plausible in a literal sense, but because it felt earned. Holmes explained every inference, every step, transforming astonishment into understanding. This was not magic, this was method. And once readers saw the world through Holmes' eyes, they could never unsee it. Yet lurking beneath this display of brilliance was a deeper question. What kind of world required such a man to exist at all? Victorian Britain was obsessed with classification. Naturalists cataloged species, engineers measured progress, doctors mapped the body, and bureaucrats attempted to systematize society itself. Yet crime remained stubbornly resistant to order. London's police forces relied heavily on intuition, confessions, and chance. Forensic science, as we know it today, did not exist. The city felt unknowable, vast, anonymous, and threatening. Holmes emerged as a corrective fantasy, a man who could impose logic on chaos, who could read the city the way others read books. In Holmes' universe, every effect had a cause, every crime left a trace, and every mystery could be solved if one possessed sufficient discipline and intellect. This was the radical promise embedded in A Study in Scarlet. Holmes represented a new moral authority, one rooted not in aristocracy or brute power, but in cognition. He did not ask for trust, he demonstrated inevitability. When Holmes explained a crime, the explanation felt final, absolute. There was no room for doubt. For readers living in an age of rapid change and social anxiety, this was intoxicating reassurance. But even as Holmes brought order to fictional chaos, his creator was unknowingly setting in motion a phenomenon that would soon escape his control. Conan Doyle himself did not initially consider Holmes his greatest work. He viewed the detective as a vehicle, not a destiny. The stories were puzzles, intellectual exercises, published cheaply and read quickly. Yet readers responded with an intensity that surprised even seasoned publishers. Letters poured in, discussions erupted. Holmes was not admired merely as entertainment, he was studied. His methods were dissected, his reasoning was memorized. Readers did not just follow Holmes, they learned from him. They began to look at the world differently, searching for patterns, meanings, and hidden truths in ordinary life. This shift marked something unprecedented. Holmes did not simply solve mysteries. He trained his audience to think like detectives. Observation became a virtue, attention to detail became a form of power. In an era increasingly shaped by science and data, Holmes offered a fictional rehearsal for modern reasoning itself, and somewhere between the turning of pages and the lighting of pipes, the boundary between fiction and reality began to thin in dangerous, unexpected ways. If you're drawn to stories like this, stories that reveal how ideas shape history, this is a perfect moment to like the video and subscribe. It tells the platform that thoughtful, deeply researched narratives deserve to reach more minds searching for clarity in a noisy world. Holmes' appeal also lay in his detachment. He was not warm. He was not kind in any conventional sense. He was aloof, even unsettling, prone to long silences, chemical experiments, and cold assessments of human behavior. Yet this emotional distance enhanced his authority. Holmes stood apart from society, observing it like a scientist studies a specimen. In a time when emotions often clouded judgment, Holmes' restraint felt revolutionary. He was the embodiment of disciplined intellect, a reminder that feelings could mislead, but facts properly interpreted never lied. By the time readers finished A Study in Scarlet, they sensed that they had encountered something fundamentally new. Holmes was not a product of his era alone, he was a response to its anxieties. He reassured readers that intelligence could still master complexity, that human reason had not been overwhelmed by modernity. But even in this first appearance, there was a quiet tension at the heart of the character. Holmes' brilliance isolated him, his clarity came at a cost. And as the world's appetite for him grew, so too did the strain between creator and creation, a strain that would soon erupt in a way no one could have predicted. When the story closes, Holmes remains at Baker Street, pipe in hand, awaiting the next knock at the door. Yet history tells us that the real knock was already coming, not from a client, but from the world itself. Readers wanted more, publishers wanted more. And Holmes, the man who never lived, was about to become impossible to kill. By the early 1890s, Sherlock Holmes was no longer merely a successful literary character, he had become a cultural fixation. Month after month, readers awaited each new story with an intensity usually reserved for political events or royal scandals. Magazine circulation surged whenever Holmes appeared, and editors quickly learned a simple truth: remove Holmes, and readers vanished with him. Arthur Conan Doyle watched this phenomenon with growing unease, sensing that something he had invented as an experiment was hardening into an obsession, and behind the applause and admiration lurked a dangerous realization: Holmes no longer belonged to his creator. The Strand magazine transformed Holmes from a novel curiosity into a recurring presence in people's lives. Short stories like A Scandal in Bohemia and The Speckled Band reached hundreds of thousands of readers across Britain and far beyond. Holmes' profile's sharp nose, penetrating eyes, pipe clenched between thin lips became instantly recognizable. Illustrations fixed his appearance in the public imagination. Readers debated his habits, his theories, even his emotional life. Holmes was not consumed passively. He was analyzed, categorized, and discussed as though he were a living man. Across the Atlantic, American publishers competed fiercely for the rights to Holmes' stories, offering Conan Doyle sums unheard of for fiction. $1 a word was not merely generous, it was transformative. Holmes became one of the most profitable literary properties of the age. His stories were translated rapidly into multiple languages, circulating throughout Europe, Asia, and the colonial world. After the Bible, no other text traveled so widely. In cafes, parlors, and train compartments, people spoke of Holmes as if he were a shared acquaintance, and with each passing year, the line between admiration and belief grew thinner. This belief took on astonishing forms. Letters arrived addressed simply to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Baker Street, London. Visitors stood outside to 21B Baker Street asking after the detective. Newspapers referenced Holmes in editorials and jokes as though readers needed no explanation. He had crossed a threshold few fictional figures ever reach. He felt real. Holmes possessed continuity, memory, and authority. He seemed to inhabit a world adjacent to the reader's own, governed by the same streets, the same anxieties, the same criminal undercurrents. Conan Doyle, meanwhile, felt increasingly trapped, watching his detective eclipse all his other ambitions, and that growing resentment would soon drive him toward a decision that shook the literary world. Doyle wanted to be taken seriously. He aspired to write historical novels, philosophical works, and plays of moral weight. Holmes, in his view, was a distraction, a clever mechanism that consumed time and energy better spent elsewhere. By 1891, Doyle resolved to end the experiment decisively. In The Final Problem, he introduced Professor James Moriarty, a criminal mastermind described as Holmes' intellectual equal in dark reflection. The two men met at the Reichenbach Falls in Switzerland, locked in a final struggle that sent them both plunging into the abyss. Doyle believed the matter settled. Holmes was dead. The public did not agree. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Readers cancelled subscriptions in protest. Londoners reportedly wore black armbands as if mourning a real death. Letters poured in, some pleading, others furious, accusing Doyle of cruelty and betrayal. Editors panicked. Publishers applied pressure. The death of Holmes had not brought closure. It had ignited outrage. For the first time, a mass audience openly rebelled against an author's narrative authority, and in that rebellion lay a startling truth. The story was no longer his to control. For nearly a decade, Doyle resisted. Holmes remained dead, frozen at the bottom of the falls, while his creator pursued other literary paths, yet Holmes refused to fade. Stage adaptations appeared, parodies multiplied. Discussions continued as if the detective might return at any moment. Holmes had entered mythic territory, the realm of figures who could fall, but never truly vanish. Like legendary heroes of old, He existed beyond a single ending. When Holmes finally returned in The Adventure of the Empty House, the resurrection was framed with almost religious care. Holmes had survived, Moriarty had not, the world exhaled. Readers welcomed him back not with skepticism, but with relief. The return did not diminish Holmes, it elevated him. Death itself had failed to claim him. From that moment on, Holmes was no longer just enduring, he was eternal. This resurrection marked a turning point in cultural history. Fiction had crossed into collective ownership. Audiences had asserted their power, demanding continuity, presence, and respect for emotional investment. Holmes became one of the first characters to exist across time, mediums, and generations without losing coherence. He was adaptable yet fixed, flexible yet unmistakable. His pipe, his logic, his moral certainty, these became constants in a changing world. As the early 20th century unfolded, Holmes persisted through upheaval, the collapse of old empires, the trauma of World War, the acceleration of technology. Each era found something useful in him. He was a stabilizing figure, proof that intelligence could still impose order. The detective who had once solved fictional crimes now solved a deeper problem, the fear that modern life was becoming incomprehensible. Conan Doyle, in the end, made peace with his creation. Holmes had surpassed intention. He had become a shared cultural instrument, a symbol rather than a story. And symbols, once released, cannot be recalled. The man who never lived had survived death, defied his creator, and demonstrated a new truth of modern storytelling. Characters could outgrow their authors, and audiences could refuse to let them die. But Holmes' survival was only the beginning. His true transformation lay ahead, not just as a character, but as a template for participation, imitation, and identity. The world was about to stop merely reading Sherlock Holmes. It was about to become him. By the early 20th century, Sherlock Holmes had crossed a boundary no fictional character had crossed before. He was no longer confined to printed pages or authorial intent. He had become participatory. Readers did not simply consume Holmes, they inhabited him. They reenacted his logic, adopted his mannerisms, and argued over his habits with the seriousness of scholars. Long before the word fandom existed, a global community had already formed around a man who had never lived, and in doing so, they were unknowingly inventing a new way for audiences to engage with stories. Holmes societies emerged first in Britain and the United States, then spread outward to Europe and Japan. Members debated the chronology of his cases, mapped his movements across London, and treated inconsistencies in the stories not as errors, but as puzzles demanding explanation. This approach, later called the Grand Game, treated Holmes as real and Arthur Conan Doyle as merely his literary agent. It was playful, obsessive, and unprecedented. Fiction had become a shared intellectual space, one where readers collaborated to extend and preserve a narrative universe. This shift mattered because it changed the relationship between story and audience forever. Holmes was not just admired, he was studied. Fans memorized passages, imitated deductions, and tested Holmes' methods against real-world observations. The detective's mindset became aspirational. To think like Holmes was to rise above confusion, emotion, and impulse. In an increasingly complex world, this promise was irresistible, yet as admiration deepened, something darker and more compelling began to emerge beneath the surface. Holmes' appeal was not purely rational, he possessed a chilling magnetism. Aloof, solitary, emotionally distant, he stood apart from society, observing it with surgical precision. Unlike traditional heroes, Holmes did not reassure through warmth or moral speeches. He reassured through certainty. His confidence bordered on arrogance. His detachment verged on inhuman, and yet audiences trusted him absolutely. In times of instability, people are drawn not to comfort, but to authority, and Holmes projected intellectual authority with unmatched clarity. This archetype rippled outward through popular culture. The genius detective became a template, shaping countless characters who followed. From pulp fiction to early cinema, from radio dramas to comic books, Holmes' shadow loomed large. Even characters who bore no physical resemblance carried his DNA, the brilliant outsider, the analytical savior, the mind that could see what others could not. The modern superhero, particularly the cerebral strategist, owes a direct debt to Holmes, and once that template existed, it could never be undone. Holmes also legitimized intellectual escapism. Before him, popular fiction often celebrated action, romance, or melodrama. Holmes proved that thinking itself could be thrilling. A raised eyebrow, a quiet deduction, a single overlooked detail could carry the same narrative weight as a chase or a duel. This redefined entertainment. It told audiences that intelligence was not dry or elitist, it was dramatic, powerful, and heroic. If this kind of storytelling resonates with you, stories that trace how ideas quietly reshape the world, liking the video and subscribing makes a real difference. It helps thoughtful, research-driven content reach others who are searching not just for entertainment, but for meaning. As the 20th century advanced, Holmes adapted effortlessly. He moved from page to stage, from silent film to sound, from radio to television. Each medium reinterpreted him, yet none diminished his essence. The deerstalker, the pipe, the violin, these became cultural shorthand. Even those who had never read the stories recognized the silhouette. Holmes had achieved something rare, symbolic immortality. Crucially, he resurfaced most powerfully during moments of uncertainty. Between world wars, during economic collapse, amid social upheaval, Holmes returned again and again. Each resurgence answered the same unspoken need. When reality felt chaotic and truth seemed elusive, Holmes promised that clarity was still possible, that facts still mattered. That careful reasoning could cut through fear and deception, but this promise would soon extend beyond culture and into the foundations of real-world institutions. By mid-century, Holmes was no longer just influencing fiction. He was shaping how people thought about intelligence itself. His methods, observation, hypothesis, evidence, revision mirrored the scientific process. Teachers referenced him. Investigators admired him. Analysts quoted him. Holmes had become a model for disciplined thinking, a patron figure for rational inquiry across professions. And yet, few realized how deep that influence ran. Holmes was not merely inspiring minds, he was quietly rewriting systems. The world had learned to admire the detective. It was about to start imitating him in earnest. The man who never lived had already changed how stories were told, how audiences participated, and how intelligence was portrayed. What remained was his most consequential transformation of all, one that would leave Baker Street behind and embed itself permanently in reality. When Arthur Conan Doyle first imagined Sherlock Holmes bending over footprints or testing chemical reactions in his lodgings, he was not describing an established profession, he was inventing one. In the late 19th century, policing was fragmented, forensic methods were inconsistent, and criminal investigation relied heavily on confession, intuition, and chance. Evidence existed, but there was no unified system to interpret it. Holmes entered this vacuum as a fictional correction, and quietly, almost invisibly, he began to change how the real world understood truth. Holmes' defining principle was simple and radical: theory must follow evidence, never the other way around. In an era when investigators often formed conclusions first and sought facts to support them, Holmes reversed the logic. He observed before judging, he measured before concluding. He treated every crime scene as a text to be read carefully, line by line. Ashes, soil, handwriting, chemicals, traces of fabric, details others dismissed as meaningless became decisive. To readers, this was thrilling fiction. To emerging professionals, it was a blueprint, and without fanfare, a fictional detective began laying the philosophical groundwork for modern forensic science. Conan Doyle drew Holmes' methods from real intellectual currents. Medical jurisprudence, early chemistry, and diagnostic reasoning informed the character. Holmes' intellectual ancestor was not a policeman, but a doctor, specifically Doyle's own mentor, Dr. Joseph Bell, whose powers of observation astonished medical students. Holmes translated clinical reasoning into investigative logic. Diagnosis became detection, symptoms became clues. And gradually institutions began to absorb this way of thinking. By the early 20th century, police forces and legal systems were professionalizing. Fingerprinting gained acceptance, ballistics emerged. Crime scene preservation became standard practice. None of these developments can be attributed to a single fictional character, but Holmes provided something just as important as technique: legitimacy. He made scientific investigation culturally authoritative. He convinced the public that logic and evidence were not cold abstractions, but moral tools capable of delivering justice, and once the public believed that, institutions had to follow. Holmes' influence extended beyond policing. Intelligence analysis, military strategy, and even legal reasoning absorbed the same core discipline: collect data, test assumptions, revise conclusions. Holmes insisted on intellectual humility before facts. He warned against confirmation bias long before the term existed. His oft-quoted maxim, once the impossible is eliminated, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth, encapsulated probabilistic reasoning in narrative form. It taught millions how to think, not what to think. As the 20th century progressed, Holmes became embedded in training manuals, lectures, and professional folklore. Investigators referenced him half-jokingly, half-seriously. Analysts admired his clarity. Scientists recognized their own methods mirrored in his approach. Holmes had crossed the final boundary. He was no longer inspiring reality from afar. He was operating within it, and in doing so, he achieved something no other fictional character had ever accomplished. Holmes' entrance also revealed something profound about culture. He did not survive because of novelty, spectacle, or sentimentality. He survived because he answered a permanent human fear, the fear that the world is unknowable. Each time society faced disruption, industrialization, war, technological acceleration, Holmes returned, adapted, and reassured. New adaptations did not replace old ones, they layered upon them. Holmes became a cultural organism, evolving without losing identity. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Holmes re-emerged in new forms, modernized, recontextualized, technologically fluent yet still unmistakable. His core remained intact: observation, discipline, reason. Whether set in gaslit London or a digitized metropolis, Holmes functioned as the same symbolic force. He reminded audiences that intelligence was still relevant in an age of overwhelming information, but beneath the reassurance lay a quieter, more unsettling implication. Holmes' world is one where everything leaves a trace. Every action has consequences, nothing truly disappears. In this sense, Holmes is not merely comforting, he is demanding. He holds humanity to account. He insists that carelessness, ignorance, and self-deception are choices, not inevitabilities. His universe does not forgive laziness of thought, and that moral rigor may be his most enduring legacy. Sherlock Holmes never lived, yet his influence is measurable. In institutions, in methods, in habits of mind, he reshaped how societies define intelligence and authority. He taught generations that clarity is not gifted, it is earned through attention and discipline. Fiction rarely achieves such penetration into reality. Holmes did so quietly, persistently, and completely, and that is why he cannot be contained by era, medium, or author. Holmes is not a relic of Victorian Britain. He is a recurring response to uncertainty itself. Whenever chaos threatens to overwhelm understanding, whenever truth feels buried beneath noise, Holmes returns, pipe-lit, eyes narrowed, already observing what others have missed. Somewhere, metaphorically, the door at Baker Street still opens, a client enters, a mystery waits. And the same promise is made once more: the world, however complex, can still be understood. The game, as always, is afoot.